What if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War? Think about it for a moment. How different would the world be today if communism had triumphed instead of democracy and capitalism? Imagine a world where the USSR is the dominant power, reshaping every corner of the globe. The life you know, the society you live in, may not even exist. But what if it did? Let's break it down and dive into a world where the Soviet Union came out on top. The rise of the Soviet Empire. If the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, the global balance of power would have shifted dramatically. The United States, which emerged as the dominant superpower after World War II, would no longer hold that position. Instead, the USSR would have expanded its influence not just over Eastern Europe but the entire world. Europe would likely have been fully under Soviet control, perhaps with more countries being absorbed into the Eastern Bloc or fully communist governments installed in places like France, Italy, and even the UK. These countries, which enjoyed democratic freedoms, would have been replaced by regimes loyal to Moscow, following the Soviet model of governance. But what would this mean for countries outside of Europe? Latin America, Asia, and Africa would see a surge in communist revolutions, backed by Soviet support. Places like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Vietnam would likely be joined by others, as the USSR worked tirelessly to expand its sphere of influence. Instead of the global capitalist market we know today, we could have seen the rise of a world united under Soviet-style socialism. The idea of democracy and freedom would have felt like an obsolete relic. The Soviet model of governance. Under Soviet rule, the model of governance would be central planning, no more free market capitalism. Imagine an entire global economy where every resource, product, and job is dictated by the state. If the Soviet Union had won, there would have been no Silicon Valley, no Google or Facebook. Instead, we'd have a state-controlled technological environment where innovation was tightly monitored. Let's talk about consumer goods. In this alternate reality, consumerism would take a backseat to government priorities. You wouldn't have the luxury of choosing from hundreds of brands at your local supermarket. Instead, you'd buy what the state told you to buy. Industries would function to meet the needs of the state, not the individual. There would be no free market to drive innovation, and the capitalist competition that powers progress would be silenced. Without the economic power of the United States, the global economy would become more homogeneous, with fewer choices and less personal freedom. Imagine life without private property. Homes, businesses, and even your car would belong to the state. The spread of communism and Soviet influence. The Soviet Union's global strategy would have continued through support for leftist movements worldwide. From the jungles of South America to the deserts of the Middle East, communism would have become a global force. The USSR's plan to export revolution could have extended beyond just military intervention. Countries like Chile, Brazil, or even South Korea might have been swept into the wave of revolution, with Soviet-backed communist governments taking power. Africa, with its struggles for independence, would have seen even more Soviet-backed coups and revolutions. The USSR would have been heavily involved in African politics, using proxy wars to secure control over resources and governments. Instead of the Cold War-era struggles we saw in places like Angola or Ethiopia, the entire continent might have shifted toward communism, with the Soviet Union controlling a vast swath of the globe. Technology and space exploration. The technological landscape would be drastically different in a world where the Soviets won. The space race wouldn't have ended with the United States landing on the moon in 1969. Instead, the Soviet Union would have led the charge in space exploration. Imagine the USSR establishing permanent bases on the moon, or even beginning missions to Mars far earlier than the US did. On Earth, the Soviet Union would likely have been the global leader in military technology. The arms race wouldn't have cooled. Instead, we could have seen a far more intense proliferation of nuclear weapons, not just between the US and the USSR, but other countries around the world too would have been pulled into the Soviet sphere and pressured to arm themselves for defense. Nations in the USSR's orbit would have adopted Soviet military technology, from tanks to fighter jets to advanced missile systems. But in terms of civilian tech, innovation would have looked very different. There would have been no tech boom fueled by companies like Apple or Microsoft. The focus of Soviet research would have been on military advancements, surveillance, and maintaining control. The USSR might have pushed for technology like mass surveillance systems, spy satellites, and possibly a global communications network that was tightly controlled by the state. The Internet and information control. Speaking of technology, one of the most significant changes would have been the lack of a free and open Internet. In the Soviet world, the Internet, if it existed, would have been heavily regulated and monitored. The government would control all information. Nothing anti-Soviet would be allowed to spread. Instead of the free-flowing data we have today, you'd be limited to what the state deems acceptable. The idea of social media would be non-existent, replaced by government-run channels of communication. Platforms like Twitter or Facebook would never have been created because free speech simply wouldn't be allowed. You would be allowed to say only what is in line with the government's ideology. Censorship would be rampant, with any form of dissent quickly silenced. In fact, surveillance would likely be a constant feature of daily life. The government would track everything: your online activity, your social interactions, your location, and it would be all in the name of maintaining security. Any anti-Soviet sentiment would be eradicated quickly. The idea of personal privacy? Gone. Cultural influence and media. In a world controlled by the Soviet Union, the cultural landscape would be starkly different. There would be no Hollywood, no rock and roll rebellion. The government would dictate what art, music, and films were acceptable. The West's culture of individualism and self-expression would be replaced with state-sponsored propaganda. Think of the USSR turning movies, music, and literature into tools of control, similar to how North Korea uses its media today. Instead of enjoying a variety of entertainment from different cultures, the media would be purely Soviet-focused. No independent journalism or creative freedom. All media would be aligned with promoting communism, glorifying the Soviet state, and condemning capitalism. If you wanted to express yourself, you'd do it within the bounds of Soviet-approved channels. A changed world order. The world's political structure would look drastically different as well. NATO would have collapsed under Soviet pressure, replaced by a global alliance of communist countries. The United Nations, as we know it, would likely be a puppet organization, with the USSR holding a dominant role. Asia, Africa, and Latin America would be divided between Soviet-influenced communist governments and a handful of capitalist holdouts. The United States would no longer be able to maintain its global alliances and would face isolation. While the Soviet Union would dominate, pockets of resistance might emerge, countries refusing to bow to Moscow's control, perhaps leading to another series of uprisings and proxy wars. The Cold War would have turned hot, but this time with the Soviets on the winning side. So, what do you think? Could you live in a world where the Soviet Union won the Cold War? A world where choices are limited, technology is controlled, and your every move is watched? It's a tough thought, but it highlights just how deeply the Cold War's outcome shaped our lives today. The US may have won, but if the Soviets had come out on top, everything we know would be different. It might not be a world we'd want, but it's definitely worth considering.